One man's trash is another man's treasure. This is the basis for the subsequent credo, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The proverb is about perception and vantage point when looking at certain life situations and how alternate points of view provide different readings and narratives. We see its expanding use over the past 4 to 5 decades on the geopolitical stage as a way to promote one narrative over another. But one thing that no one wants to explore is how in today's day and age this credo's true driver is racism. How when the violent defense of freedoms, justice, and the simplest form of good over evil is only considered freedom fighting or defending of freedom when it's a Westerner who's the instigator of that violence. Anyone but Westerners who commit such acts of aggression are labeled terrorists. And it seems like Arabs and Muslims bear the brunt of that label. Now, by no means does that mean that these Westerners don't commit such heinous violence onto innocent bystanders. They've done more damage than most Arabs and Muslims. Yet again, no blonde, blue-eyed, Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, or Slavic person, basically white people, have really been categorized as such. They might be referred to as a militant, an extremist, or even a fascist, but a terrorist? Never ever. So to keep it as simple as possible, how do we define the term terrorism? It's a tough one, as there's no real consensus on one definition by any global institution. But what we do know is that it has to do with committing extreme violence towards innocent people, with an intention to cause fear, pain, and suffering, primarily to achieve political or ideological gains. So the factors are as follows: violence, innocent people, death, fear, suffering, and finally, ideology. Now, on this basis, if we examine a country like, let's say, Israel, it is and has always been a state that is committed to terrorism. The only difference between it and Eastern nations labeled as such is that it has a strong public relations machine that has established a mirage of democracy, civility, and decency. This facade is further enforced by Western powers who either succumb to Israel because of its highly influential foreign-based political power, or due to a guilty Western conscience, since they, the West themselves, were who truly actioned hate and ethnic cleansing of the Jews. Israel today propagates terrorism through the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, its national army. I don't need to go too far into what acts of immorality and violence the IDF is committing today. I'll leave that to another video I've released with a link above. I want to go back to before Israel was even a nation. You see, Zionist leadership in the first half of the 20th century understood fully that only violence, extreme violence on the physical, mental, and spiritual front was the only way to achieve their colonialist settler aspirations. Meaning terrorism. The British Mandate Administration, neutral envoys, Palestinians, and the Arabs were all victims of this Zionist strategy in spreading fear and causing destruction. Zionist military groups were labeled terrorist organizations by the British, Americans, and the United Nations, with their members and leaders clearly identified and known. Yet upon Israel becoming a nation, all Zionist terrorists and their acts were wiped clean, forgiven, and forgotten. And this is what I want to counter. Remind ourselves of what those militias were and who led them. To shed some light, the IDF was actually a product of the aggregation of many existing paramilitary Zionist organizations. Some were labeled as terrorist groups, while others weren't, even though the latter themselves had engaged in extreme types of violence. The first of which is the Haganah, the supposed defender of the Jewish presence in Palestine during the British Mandate. The Haganah was established in 1920 and formally disbanded, then merged into the IDF by 1948. This organization was one of the paramilitary groups who were not categorized as terrorist organizations, mainly because in theory they publicly opposed the targeting of the British Mandate officials, personnel, or interests during their Mandate-era activity. But this today is countered by substantial evidence that presents a totally different picture. Within the Haganah was a specially trained and violent force called the Palmach that did heavily engage in clandestine efforts. Efforts such as the bombing of the SS Patria in Haifa, a ship deporting illegal Jewish immigrants that led to the death of over 200 European Jews and 50 British crew members and soldiers. The Haganah would be the main implementers of Plan Dalet, otherwise known as Plan D, that put forth the intentional strategy of creating fear, havoc, and killings preceding the expulsion of Palestinians, both Christian and Muslim, from their homes and lands, causing a general atmosphere of terror amongst the population. Benny Morris, an Israeli historian, recalls in his book 1948 and After that 55% of the total exodus of Palestinians was caused by our Haganah operations. For added knowledge on the role of the Haganah and other Israeli paramilitary groups in the Nakba, a great article that echoes the atrocities committed by the Zionists can be found at Le Monde Diplomatique. I've placed a link in the video description below for your ease of access. Many other violent events speak of the nature of the Haganah. The attack on the Atlit detention camp by the Palmach to free Jewish immigrants held in detention by the British. Numerous attacks on British police and the bombing of mandate infrastructure, such as the Nights of the Train, when railroads were sabotaged and many British guard boats were sunk. The second paramilitary group was the Irgun, that operated from 1931 to 1948. That was a breakaway from the Haganah and was founded by Ze'ev Jabotinsky and based on a newer ideology at the time, revisionist Zionism, meaning expanding the colonialization and settling of land no matter the means. The Irgun were violent from the very outset and were shortly thereafter violent towards Palestinians and the British administration. They were labeled terrorists by most, if not all, Western nations and media. The Irgun were highly active in terrorist planning and even termed their exploits as active defense. Their most famous act was the bombing of the King David Hotel that saw the death of 91 people, Arabs, Jews, British, and others. This event was followed by the Irgun blowing up the British embassy in Rome in 1946, with further attacks on British officer clubs in Austria and Germany. The Irgun were also heavily into personal assassinations of British leaders and military staff during the Mandate years, such as in the Sergeant's Affair. The final paramilitary group that was also labeled a terrorist organization was the Lehi, referred to as the Fighters for the Freedom of Israel, or more appropriately, the Stern Gang. The Lehi were a breakaway faction from the Irgun and operated from 1940 to 1948, and its mandate followed a simple ideology: to evict the British through violence, the colonizing British, as they put it. A group that I might add at some point wanted to ally itself with Hitler and his Nazi party. The Lehi were purely barbaric and were responsible for assassinations of neutral personalities acting as mediators to alleviate the vast levels of violence taking place within the British Mandate, such as Folke Bernadotte, a Swedish politician in 1948 who was appointed as the United Nations mediator in Palestine. Another high-ranking assassination was the killing of Lord Moyne, the British Minister of State in the Middle East, by two Lehi members in 1944. One of the worst events that the Lehi took part in was the massacre at the town of Deir Yassin. Actually, it was all three organizations spoken about so far, the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, that took part in what truly sparked the universal fear and terror felt amongst the Palestinians. In April 1948, just over a month before the establishment of Israel and the full-fledged activation of Plan D, the Zionist joint militia operation attacked the village near Jerusalem and murdered 140 villagers, including women and children, from a population of 700. That's 20% of the population. So now we know what these organizations were and the terrible acts of terrorism they committed, but who were they? Who led or represented them? I want to take a small cross-section of these leaders and help you understand what I mean when I say the acceptance of the term freedom fighter versus a terrorist is all about narrative and perspective. You see, many of these Zionist terrorists, post-Israeli independence, became members of parliament or of government, even reaching the highest level of national leadership. Within the Irgun, there was obviously Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Original name, Vladimir Yevgenyevich Jabotinsky, the founder of the organization. But other members included Itzhak Shimshlevich, known as Itzhak Ben Zvi, the first president of Israel from 1952 to 1963. There was Yakov Winiarski, also known as Yakov Meredor, the Minister of Economics. And last but not least was Menachem Volkovich Begin, known as Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel from 1977 to 1983. Imagine that, a recognized terrorist as the Prime Minister. For the Lehi, the names are no less troubling. Gulah Cohen and Nathan Friedman Yellen, known as Nathan Yellen Moore, became members of the Knesset. Baruch Korf, aka Nixon's rabbi, who became a close confidant of President Richard Nixon and who was arrested in London on suspicion of involvement in a Stern Gang plot to bomb Buckingham Palace. And last of all is Yitzhak Yezernitsky, or Yitzhak Shamir, the Prime Minister of Israel from 1986 to 1992, who led the Lehi from 1942 to 1948. Within the Haganah were, of course, David Grun, known as David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel from 1955 to 1963, Yaakov Dostrovsky, aka Yaakov Dori, who became the IDF's Chief of Staff, Yigal Allon, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, Rehavam Ze'evi and Moshe Dayan, who became cabinet ministers, and finally, Ariel Sharon and the Nobel laureate Yitzhak Rabin, both of whom would become prime ministers of the Zionist state, all terrorists. One funny side note here, Carola Ruth Westheimer, the famous Dr. Ruth Westheimer, the German, Israeli, and American prominent sex therapist, loved and adored by a significant number of American TV and literature audiences, was a member of the Haganah and trained as a sniper, also a terrorist. The problem is that these individuals, beyond becoming local leaders and holding substantial authority, not only towards the Jews of Israel, but towards the local Palestinians, also became internationally recognized politicians and personalities, given audience, given trust, assimilated into the international community, and thus brought with them their immorality, injustice, and violent leanings onto the global stage and within institutions that were supposed to promote peace, freedom, and justice. Terrorists exist today in Israel on two fronts. The IDF, for sure, who have since the establishment of Israel reflected an unconditional affinity to violence. Most, of course, have been against Palestinians and Arabs, but even at times on Americans themselves, such as the famous terrorist act on the USS Liberty in 1967. Israel claims mistaken identity. The rest of the world is not so convinced. Beyond the IDF, you then also have the new Zionist extremist settler gangs who are neither official military nor police forces, but are armed to the teeth, such as the Lehi, who number approximately 10,000 members, the Hilltop Youth, who number around 5,000 and who the IDF recruits from. And finally, you have La Familia, hardline hooligan ultras initially starting as a football support gang, but have broken out of the meld and initiated repetitive, racially incited violence on Palestinians and Arabs. These groups are not outlawed or held accountable by neither the legal system in Israel nor by the IDF when they commit acts of violence, even when in the presence of the IDF. Just to put things into perspective, these three groups alone amount to the aggregate of 20,000 Israelis who are violent towards innocent people due to their extremist ideology, instilling fear and terror into the Palestinians. Terrorists. The question here is, how does Israel view this violent past, the Zionist terrorist persona? The truth is that when examining various elements in Israeli society, it is prideful memory of terrorists that is loud and in the open. Museums and monuments are littered all across the nation. Digitally, if you access websites such as Taking Back the Narrative, a Zionist education initiative, you can start to see the real-time duality of narratives. Their terrorists are freedom fighters. All these paramilitary organizations deemed historically as terrorist are arrogantly labeled as Jewish resistance. And it seems to me that when a society of a nation still believes that the historic or ongoing evil acts inflicted on a weaker and suppressed people were necessary and justified, then what this signifies is that such a society is weighted down heavily with immorality. Building a nation on violence, suppression, and injustice always leads to a certain inevitable poetic and karmic rebalance. And sooner than later, this moment will be on its way. no doubt about it.